Good morning, all. It's wonderful to follow our Deputy State Historic Preservation Commissioner, to see that this level of commitment to the conversation we're having today. Daniel, thank you for your generosity of time and commitment to be with all of us. Of course, we all knew the birthday was coming, and what I really wanted to do was try to do something a little different. We're in a moment right now. As Daniel just alluded to, as he recognized the absence of so many cultural landscape typologies associated with cultural lifeways here in New York State that have been absent from the register, this is a moment for landscape activism. And my sense of Olmsted and the movement is landscape architects. We're all very happy to carry the mantle of Olmsted, the progenitor, the introducer of the term landscape architecture to Americans. And for us to own it very proudly, for better or worse. We can have debates about what the best term is. But what we don't debate is, I ask you to think about whether or not Olmsted not only introduced landscape architecture, but Olmsted introduced landscape activism to our culture. And looking at the Olmsted movement, looking at that more than 200 properties throughout the US that are designated, what can we learn about the Olmsted movement that will inform advocacy efforts in allied disciplines today? I want to recognize that there are a number of people in this room who were trailblazers, they were pioneers, they were leaders. Patricia O'Donnell, Lori Olin, Arlene Levy. These people are my mentors and my friends. And I am personally honored to be on the program with two of my heroes this morning. With that, I'm going to put my glasses on so I don't go in the wrong direction. So I ask all of you during this talk is to think about yourself. What is the Olmsted inside of you? Now, it's always interesting to me that in terms of what we decide to show as imagery, like other Olmsted advocates and scholars, the Olmsted Santa Claus seems to be everywhere right now. And what I'd like to do today, and this was the winning choice last week at the GSD, was hot Olmsted with cheekbones and the Greek sailor hat. And and he did popularize that hat before Zorba the Greek and before John Lennon when he was at the peak of his career. But all kidding aside, the way in which we communicate Olmsted, the way we illustrate Olmsted, that is really the foundation of my Fred talk today. And the cornerstone of this is a profound foundation of love. I defy this audience to think of other practitioners in the design canon in the US to tell me the name of a landscape architect that conjures such love. We can debate, Frank Lloyd Wright's place and a handful of others, but in terms of pure love, when things got pretty bad, the love did not ebb. It only grew. And, during Olmsted's life, the love began during that lifetime. Even people he didn't always agree with, like Mariana Griswold von Rensselaer, who in Art Out of Doors published how, look outside, people, because in addition to architecture, sculpture, and painting, the greatest art form is right outside of the Met. So this love, this proselytizing of Olmsted began in the 19th century during his productive career. What I want to do is think about, those that I've had the good fortune to know in the discipline of landscape architecture and what their love was for Olmsted. Larry Halpern, for example, was happy to be boastful about his love of Mr. Olmsted. This bas-relief hung over his desk in his office through multiple moves. He was a Sunday painter. He made this bookmark one time after I had paid a visit, and it was right there with all of his Judeo-Hebrew close objects in his life. Upon reflection in an oral history we did with Larry Halpern, he noted that he felt wonderful about the fact that he had brought Olmsted to the FDR Memorial, choosing the same stone type that was at Central Park. So somehow he noticed that Mr. Olmsted and Mr. Roosevelt were together there. he would talk about how nothing was really purposeful in terms of Olmsted, but somehow it was there inside that love. And if we think about him passing the baton, for example, to Rich Haig, who began his career in his office, and we see Larry under the desk lamp in the background. Rich spoke as a Seattleite during our oral history with him, and noting this legacy of more than 3 decades in Seattle and the challenge of managing change in these resources, but still showed profound affection for Olmsted. And some of you may or may not know that Mr. Olin began his career in Rich Haig's office. He is the kind of wimpy kid over here that you never thought about him quite being so geeky, but Lori, you've come a long way, baby. But when you see the drawings for Gasworks Park, know that if they look familiar, they were in Mr. Olin's hand. And so, to me, I think a revelation when we did an oral history with Lori, and he compared Olmsted as being the General Eisenhower of landscape architecture. You can watch this on our YouTube page. He also notes, and this is one of Lori's drawings of Central Park, Olmsted saw the city was the problem, and he saw how to deal with it, and he worked to the scale of the problem. We've also had the good fortune, the very first oral history we did was with Carol Johnson. She and Cornelia Obelander were friends for many decades. And they both really came to Olmsted through women's colleges, noting that this epiphany happened when they realized that the siding of the buildings were very much the responsibility of Olmsted. Carol Johnson, like Halprin, noted that there was a little bit of Olmsted in everything that she did. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Cultural Landscape Foundation, we are an education and advocacy organization. We are often involved in Section 106 reviews. We are currently involved in Section 106 on the Shockoe Hill Burial Ground with a consortium of other partners. We're sitting out the Midway Plaisance, so I think your thesis may have an opportunity to be daylit today, Daniel. But through our programs, there are 4 core programs. What's out there? We've published, you'll see in your tote bag, in concert with Planting Fields Foundation and author Arlene Levy, a guide to about a dozen landscapes that are out here on Long Island. They're part of about 2,500 sites in our national database, which is all GPS enabled. Our pioneers, we have about 1,100 on our website and nearly 24 oral histories. Our landslide annual program on Tuesday next week, we will unveil a collection and a thematic report of 12 at-risk Olmsted landscapes throughout North America. And then, of course, we are the home to the Cornelia Hahn Obelander International Prize in Landscape Architecture, the first prize with a purse of $100,000. Julie Bargman was our inaugural laureate last fall. So what I'd like to do today is take you on a bit of a personal journey in the first part. In particular, I kind of come on the scene in part 2. The first part is the birth of the Olmsted Renaissance, and I'll conclude with a dozen avenues for looking forward today in terms of the work that still needs to be done regarding Olmsted, the successive firm. The first is the first part of the Renaissance. It was in the mid-1960s that Al Fine, who was teaching at Harvard with Mr. Norman Newton, decided to mount an exhibition at Harvard on the centennial of the use of the term landscape architect. I also want to mention it's the same year that landmark status was granted to Fairstead, although it's who's faced an uncertain future for many decades in the same way that the Olmsted Beale House has more recently. Harvard was approached by ASLA National, by Sidney Shercliffe. That's not a familiar name. It was Arthur Shercliffe's son. Arthur Shercliffe was a former employee of the Olmsted office for about 7 years. Newton basically said, we need to put on an exhibition, we need to take this show on the road, and it did go on the road. What's interesting is all the bold-faced names that you see here all became people that valued history and culture in landscape architecture, either as academics, as writers, as practitioners. And so their time with Al Fine was formative as young graduate students. Immediately following the exhibition, a book was published, which is the one that you see here in the center. For example, I didn't really know a lot about Michael Weinmar or Weinmayer. No, Arlene, how am I mispronouncing that? Okay, well, we'll compare notes afterwards. So it's okay. But I didn't know, for example, that he had done an earlier plan for Franklin Park before the Massachusetts DEM started focusing on parks. The two books that you see bracketing this image, the first, if you've never seen it before, Landscape into Cityscape, is a magnificent read today. Al Fine's opening essay is the first really substantive essay written about Olmsted, and that it includes all of Olmsted's writings, many of which are prescient and still hold up. On the right-hand side, 72, was Mr. Fine introducing Olmsted and environmentalism. We had a republication of Walks and Talks as well. In 1969, these books were reviewed by someone who was probably pretty low-key up until this moment, Dr. Charles McLaughlin, of course, who would go on to be editor of the Olmsted Papers. And he celebrated this plethora of publications and this opportunity for a sort of a do-it-yourself opportunity to sort of find the Olmsted you'd like to find. So I would say that by the late 1960s, the Olmsted movement was off and running. In 1972, J. Carter Brown at the National Gallery, working in concert with the Whitney Museum in New York and curator Bill Alex, mounted an exhibition of Olmsted's work. He noted at the time that Olmsted was one of America's most prescient and sensitive artists. The show opened in New York. It had a companion publication by a Betsy Barlow. Some of us know her as Betsy Barlow Rogers. Ada Louise Huxtable, upon reviewing the two shows in the New York Times, notes, if the two major exhibitions running concurrently at New York's Whitney Museum and the National Gallery in Washington do not establish the protean talent of Frederick Law Olmsted, Charlton Heston will have to play him. Not sure how I feel about that. Here's the exhibition brochure from the Washington, D.C. show that was done with Jane Loeffler doing all the heavy lifting. You'll notice at the top of the image on the bottom right was sort of a cyclorama, a 360-degree immersion through visual slides of Olmsted landscapes to take you on Olmsted's journey. That same year, we had the formal launching of the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers in 1972. The first volume would follow 5 years later. And of course, the seminal work by Laura Wood Roper, 1973. The New York Times Wayback Machine never disappoints. It does have Olmsted with an A. 77, for those that were doing the research back then, 27,000 items were microfiched. To this day, I can still hear that whirring sound in my head. And how many of us have carpal tunnel today because of that experience? Also in 77, the John Charles Olmsted Papers, again, thanks to Mr. Fine and his friendship with the next generation, folks in the Olmsted family negotiated 5,000 personal letters. These are magnificent personal recollections. I see Christy and Arlene nodding, where Olmsted speaks, John Charles Olmsted speaks in a very unbridled and open way to his wife. So do keep those in mind if you're doing research. And then I wanted to sort of look sideways to Fairstead during this time because I think so much of our knowledge today seems to be driven by historic images and how great the site looks today. And we tend to forget that during this period, this is what Fairstead looked like. This is the condition of the drawings. This was the condition of the building in a documentation effort in 1977. Two of the oral histories we did as well with Stu Dawson and Ed Dougherty, who are both plus or minus 90 years old today. God bless them both. And Stu notes, other than Norman Newton's passion and respect for Olmsted, we never even visited Olmsted's office. Dougherty of Atlanta was there on a 2-week plus or minus internship and said the place was in shambles. And as a business, as a professional office, it was hardly active. So we lose sight of that. And so that kind of, to me, is chapter 1. Chapter 2, there I am with David Cassidy here. I was a stumpy. I came to planting fields to learn my plants. I had previously gone to Farmingdale and came to planting fields to learn my plants. So in several years, our relationship will be eligible for listing on the National Register. But, you know, to me, what was interesting being a native New Yorker, you know, I was very aware of Central Park. I was aware of these kinds of events. I didn't know until Marie's recent writings about the happenings in Central Park that were taking place to tell people it's okay to go back there. My recollections of Central Park, The one I remember the most was waiting 16 hours for tickets for Pirates of Penzance and freezing my toes off for the gates. I didn't go to Barbra Streisand, but I knew that everybody was talking about it. And, my parents grew up, I had records like this one of Nina Simone's in my house. Diana Ross, of course, how could that not be a story that we all remember? I think most of us, though, come to Olmsted through film. And we think about the starring role that Olmsted landscapes have played in cinema that are memory-laden and trigger an emotional response. Let's not forget that the seventh aspect of integrity is feeling and association. Although less tangible, this is the power of landscape. This is the power of Olmsted. So let's kind of pull back a little bit, and now it's 1980. And this is a seismic shift. We see Fairstead finally acquired by the National Park Service. We have the birth of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, and we have the creation of the Central Park Conservancy. All three of those things happened in 1980. 1981, I was in my fourth year of undergraduate studies. I went to the Metropolitan. I passed the Burgers of Calais and the gates of hell, and I made my way to Olmsted. And it was unbelievable to experience that. I went to the dairy afterwards to buy a copy of the publication, and once again, there was Mr. Fine greeting us. Since the 1950s, Olmsted has emerged from relative obscurity to national prominence. Olmsted's varied contributions as a theorist, planner, designer, and administrator are relevant to the needs of our nation today. What gives Olmsted's Renaissance a special dimension is that so many of his original creations, although badly in need of maintenance and repair, are still mostly intact and vital to communities surrounding them. And finally, Olmsted's Renaissance, therefore, derives from the continuing relevance of his work and his ideas on which his efforts were based. These are all photographs taken during that time. The top left-hand photo is, in fact, Patricia O'Donnell looking out in Prospect Park. This is about 1986, I believe. This, of course, has since been rebuilt by the Alliance. It's a lakeside pavilion. The image on my favorite image is the bench on the top, which is some sort of torture device. But, imagine this is what our parks look like. For the younger people that are here today, this is what our nation's legacy of parks looked like in the 1980s. But yet, the love is still there. This is confounding to me as someone who is an advocate, where so often that when places are in poor condition, they often die quiet deaths. Didn't happen here. Didn't happen because of the foundational knowledge that began with the two Charlies, Dr. Beveridge and Dr. McLaughlin. And they were part of a group of folks through NAOP that took it on the road. They even took it to Liverpool. You see Charlie McLaughlin at the top of the bus on the right and Charlie Beveridge on the bottom that was in Illinois. These photos are courtesy of Arlene Levy, and you see, if you know some of the players, it's a mixture of people. It's historians, it's landscape architects, it's advocates, it's people who are not professionals who just live in a community and want to see better parks. This is what these places looked like in Seattle's Olmsted Boulevards. This is Louisville, Kentucky on the right, Shawnee Park on the bottom, Iroquois Park, where they just cut off the whole top of the forest. They didn't understand tree management back in that period. And I want to spend a moment on this image because it was in working on this talk that I realized that many of the women that you see here in these images taught me that to be a landscape architect was to be an advocate, that we cannot be complacent, that we have to take a position. Just as one example, the second image on the top left is the late Sally Harbo, who was a very, very proper Southern lady in Atlanta. And she decided when they were building the Carter Library that they weren't going to cut down all of Olmsted's trees. And a la what we saw in Central Park with the Adventure Playground, we saw baby strollers, we saw walkers, we saw women literally chaining themselves to construction equipment. They were arrested and carried off. A hair never fell out of place. It was Teflon coated, but nevertheless, they were ready for battle, and they did so. Caroline Loughlin, Noni Ames, Irma Trenta, Arlene Levy, Marion Presley, Carolyn Etter, Betsy Sher-Gross, Susan Rademacher, Kathleen Gallup, Ann Satterthwaite, Sandy Sparks, and Vicki Ranney. And of course, Betsy and Tupper in the black and white photographs. This was the birth of a movement. These are oral histories that should be told and a story that should be chronicled. There are lessons to be learned here. Back in the day of shoulder pads, Patricia O'Donnell took it to Capitol Hill, and here she is testifying. They said, we're going to create a theme study in landscape architecture. Patricia O'Donnell with the late Phil Winslow, Gail Gillett. I mean, think about this. Here is an organization that is 4 years old, and they're already figuring out, okay, this is great, but we have to think bigger. And they took it to the Hill. And although we didn't get what we want, it was inspiring. It was inspiring to see landscape architects, advocates, and colleagues testifying on the Hill, 1984. And then it spills out into the profession. It becomes work for landscape architects. Tony Walmsley, Bruce Kelly, Phil Winslow, others. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management, 1986, $12 million for 12 parks. The Prospect Alliance, the Conservancy Lead the Way, Druid Hill Parks competition, and others. This became something that was then penetrating the much larger landscape architecture community. And then it gave rise to dozens, if not hundreds, of conservancies, many associated with Olmsted's own legacy. So here's my simple kind of theory. You start with love, then you get some badass women who are willing to stick their neck out and make good trouble. Then you have the work of two scholars, and you have the essential foundations that are available in the archives. You have the foundation for a movement. What can we learn from this? Well, the cornerstone of this is publish or perish. So many of the landscapes that we're now turning to today that are associated with cultural narratives and cultural lifeways have had the same absence of scholarship for so many years that landscape architecture suffered from. That too is changing, and that will be significant. Aside from the Olmsted papers, there were dozens of books written about Olmsted from a national perspective, from a localized park or park system perspective. There were traveling exhibitions, such as the one at the Canadian Centre for Architecture that was overseen by Dr. Cynthia Zajcewski. As we saw outside, there were children's books. There were books that defy convention in terms of what they were. Was it fiction? Was it nonfiction? Is it a biography about a person or a place? Olmsted inspires the blurring of these interpretations because it's so fertile. Postage stamps, documentaries, and then, of course, Olmsted's own writings. There is such a body of knowledge here and a richness ready to be unlocked on a constant basis. Grady Clay, who was one of my heroes, one of the first urban affairs editors for a newspaper in America in the early 1950s at the Courier-Journal, was, of course, editor-in-chief at Landscape Architecture magazine for, I think, 32 years. And he was invited to speak at the NAOP conference in 1983. And he notes, I was wrong-headed enough to think some years back this well-meaning little enterprise would flutter into public view and then disappear among that host of good causes that never get anywhere. It was all quite inspiring. I felt I was present at the moment the whole thing had finally achieved critical mass and would become a movement. If you don't believe me, publish or perish. Look at the National Register nominations. This is not everything, it's what I could find. This is a bit of a windshield survey, if you will, but imagine these are only landscapes designated by the Olmsted firm alphabetically C through F. F through L, L to O, P to S. It's extraordinary. I don't think there's probably another practitioner in American history that has so many designations. In this case, of course, it's Olmsted and the successor firm. There's also probably around 36 National Historic Landmarks. Not all of these have significance in landscape architecture because they were done early on. Some of them, as we heard yesterday with the IMA, Indianapolis Museum of Art, do. So what I'd like to spend the rest of my time now with is, with that as a foundation of the movement, look forward. A dozen ways to expand what we already know about Olmsted. So first is no A. I mean, we are laughing at this, but it's not funny anymore, people. It is ridiculous. This is, I mean, whoops, I guess I thought let me just go back a sec. Yeah, I thought I had a different image here than I do. But literally this, I always do it last 7 days, and when I did last 7 days yesterday, it included the Metropolitan Museum. I thought, come on, people. But, the Olmsteds had the same problem. This is actually in the archives at Fairstead. I don't know who this woman was, but she's definitely active. And I really thought this was kind of amazing because this felt like a Larry Halpern graphic to me, and it was out of the Olmsted office, so there was, again, something subliminal happening there. But anyway, this is a problem that's been going on for a very long time. The other thing is, it didn't help that the National Register nomination for Fairstead, they got a little lazy. I guess they didn't have spell check then. But seriously, it's true, right? So, yeah, this stuff happens. I don't know what else to say. Oh, there it is. There's my Metropolitan one. I did put it in here. Yeah, October 5th. I thought, oh, good for you, Met. Okay.
Last year, Central Park Conservancy.
Wow. Wow. That was even with the centerfold of Vox in July, wasn't it? Sorry, that laid an egg. Sorry. They all can't be winners. Sorry. We saw this yesterday, but I too was kind of giddy with delight when I thought, maybe they're funnier out in the Pacific Northwest, but this to me is just such a happy image. But all kidding aside, we know he looked tired, but he didn't live from 1822 to 1957. I mean, this image, man, I mean, it's sort of like out of a Christmas spectacular, and there's something abominable about it. But all kidding aside, I get so excited when I see a picture I haven't seen before. It's like suddenly, oh, wow, Junior comes to life as this young kid. And, this was John Charles Olmsted when he was starring in the Sherlock Holmes story. But again, who's Marion? How many people have heard of Marion Olmsted before today? Good for you, Newt. But seriously, think about how much we have written about this man and the firm and practice. And there's a sister in the picture. She's doing little drawings for Felsted, where Olmsted is spending his twilight period. Who is she, right? So when I look at the family tree, the other thing that's always intriguing to me, and I don't know how many people here have multiple siblings, but do you have pictures with your father? Have you ever seen a photograph of Olmsted with his kids? Why is it that I can show you this picture, but we don't have one of the Olmsteds together? Why is that? That makes me very curious. But we have the tree, and we know who was there to the bitter end. And we can zoom in on these people. We could look at the last chapter of Joe Hudak and Artemis Partridge Richardson, and we can begin to lift the veil to understand their contributions as well as so many others. It's fun to me to look at in the files in the last chapter of Olmsted Associates because you can see how they're grappling with whether they want to be viewed as being hip and modern or more nostalgic and historic by their choice of fonts. So they decide for something with a little bit from both. Okay. Olmsted, the reformer. How many people here knew that Olmsted was responsible for creating the Nation publication? And don't raise your hand if you learned it in a conference in the last 2 weeks. This kind of blows my mind. When you read Olmsted's plea for independent journalism, it could have been written today. It's extraordinary. We're having a meeting at the end of this to sort of reconcile everything you're going through emotionally right now. The other thing is when we think about the Red Cross and our wounded warriors, do we associate Olmsted with having a significant role after what he experiences in the battlefield landscape? what he sees. Like everything else, this is a self-published publication by Olmsted, Hospital Transports. We talk about Olmsted and slavery and his journey through the seaboard slave states, but also if you go back 4 years earlier to Walks and Talks of an American Farmer, he is already aware of being an American abroad and how he is perceived by people in Great Britain. And this is of concern to him. I just have to say yesterday, and it was the second time I've seen Sarah present that chronology, it brought tears to my eyes, and it really just sort of coalesced and came together in a way to understand these kind of narratives that someone like Olmsted is wrestling with. Okay, Olmsted the advocate activist. I love the idea of basically working in a city, then saying in 1879, I can't deal with New York anymore, I can't deal with the politics, I am out of here. Then self-publishing. If you haven't read this, Google it. It is awesome, and make sure you've got some vodka. This disorganized body has been masquerading before the public, a headless trunk without policy, without order, without well-defined purpose. So it's 3 years after he's left New York, and he is pissed off at the way the park is being managed. And he lets everyone know it. So the landscape architects here, would you ever think of taking such a position in such a public way? What does that look like? I also love the kind of curatorial aspect of his advocacy. We all know this photograph of his trip to Yosemite. We might know that there was a Chinese chef that was part of that trip. I learned at a symposium last week that the foreign help were paid less than the American help on that trip. But the idea of having a chef, having the Speaker of the House there, and reading your report and getting people seduced by and in that landscape to get what you want. Olmsted notes, the duty of preservation is the first which falls upon the state under the act of Congress, because the millions who are hereafter to benefit by the act have the largest interest in it, and it is the largest interest should be first and most strenuously guarded. This is a theme you see again and again with Olmsted. You see it in Washington, D.C., with what was farmland that was intended to be creating a dignified gateway into Washington, D.C., that would have fallen prey to development. So while the Capitol grounds are being built and he sees all the attention being paid to the architectural embellishment, he says, hey, people, look over here. We're going to lose this, and this has to be safeguarded. The same, of course, with the Niagara Reservation. So this idea of serving everyone. American waterfronts, we see him writing about this in more public publications like The Century and Scribner's Monthly, about a plea for not having this just be for industry, but being for civicness and public enjoyment along the waterfront. 5 is Olmsted the bureaucrat, and as someone who spent 15 years at the federal government, I like the word bureaucrat. I think bureaucrats can do really, really good things, and I wanted to just read one sentence from a New Yorker piece that came out in 2020 by Matt Dellinger. He notes, in terms of Olmsted, whether scenic beauty or war, hospital or park, Olmsted believed that we were all in it together, like it or not. Olmsted, the inventor of new landscape typologies. Has there been a landscape architect that has invented so many landscape types? The Parkway, of course, was imported, introduced in the US, 6,600 linear feet at Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. Urban greenways or park systems, Boston's Emerald Necklace, Olmsted and Vox in Buffalo, the Olmsted Brothers in Baltimore or Seattle. The idea of the ecologically performative landscape. Think about the Back Bay fence. The scenic reservation. The idea of capturing this land before suburbanization does, laying lightly on the land, and recognizing that there would be less manipulated than urban parks, but they should be protected, and the elements should have a quietude in their design. 7, Olmsted, the innovator. expanding the purview of the landscape architect. This is also, I think, ripe for much further investigation. When you think about a place like Lake Wales, Florida, we don't often think of the Olmsted firm designing all of the building architecture in a place, the awnings, the design of roof shingles, the floor plans. Basically, every building typology here was under the purview of the landscape architect, as was the signage, as was the light fixtures inside and out, as was the graphic design of the labels on the fruit crates. The Olmsted firm designed the total design environment. At the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., the Olmsted firm got to study the building mass, the impact of shadow, before the architects were let loose to tell us what they thought. They took charge and they looked at various studies to look at the building massing for the boys' choir school and its impact on any future garden there. In Rochester, New York, along the Genesee River, they came up with the ideas, the super elevations, what the vehicular experience would be for an arrival into Genesee Valley Park and to cross the river. They were the ones that were leading this and not the engineers. Here on Long Island, you can see buildings at so many projects where there are basically features in the landscape that are part of a symphonic common language of a design vocabulary. This is one of my favorites. I think there's a real market for this today, Gina. The proposed mushroom beds that were done out here in Oyster Bay. I know a lot of people, probably more people are growing mushrooms today than knew that there was a Marion Olmsted. But nevertheless, I think there's a market here and the Olmsteds designed it for us. Civic art, beginning with Central Park and then extending into so many other commissions, whether it was light fixtures along the parkways in Louisville, or unique types of seating in Boston's Emerald Necklace, or in Bok Tower, where it was integrated with an interpretive placard. The Olmsteds redefined the memorial landscape. I think a lot of us know about this project. We might not have ever seen these notes from the Olmsted office, which tell us why we have the dilemma we do today at the tidal basin. But look at this. The Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial. This is not about plopping a memorial down in a landscape. This is about sculpting something from the land, working in harmony with the topography of the site, and then the borrowed view is in fact the memorial. The memorial is one with the landscape. When dear Charles Eliot died at the age of 37 and the Olmsted firm mourned the loss, his Blue Hills Reservation, which of course 1890 is the trustees, a young Arthur Shercliffe does these beautiful drawings that you see here. And what is created here is the memorial bridge, a passageway, if you will, in which this memorial is integrated in the landscape that was beloved and protected by Eliot. An entire landscape rather than just your traditional World War I memorial to veterans. We have in Jacksonville, Florida, a memorial landscape that is a processional landscape experience along the river. The entire park is the memorial. Olmsted the Mentor. And here, we have seen publications lifting the veil, for example, such as Hope Cushing's on Arthur Shercliffe. These are his before and after drawings for a clogged notch, if you will, along the trustees. Warren Manning has had a monograph as well by Robin Carson. William Lyman Phillips by Faith Jackson. These veils have been lifted. But how many of these names are people familiar with? Perhaps E.T. Meesh or Carl Russ Parker? What do we know about Percy Jones? I can tell you that Jones's fingerprints are all over Washington, D.C. during the Beaux-Arts era when Olmsted Jr. was serving on the Commission of Fine Arts. And Jones was no longer an employee of the firm, but he was in constant communication with Olmsted. And this is not a one-off. This happened very, very frequently. When Meesh, for example, goes to Portland, Oregon, Meesh then builds out on John Charles's vision for a plan. And the renderings even read, if you look at them at a glance, you'd think they came out of the Olmsted office because Meesh learned how to draft there. So there are just so many more extended stories to be told for this century of design. And if you go into our database, if this is new to you at tclf.org, you'll see that one of the things we try to do is lift the veil on all of the designers that contributed to a place, and each of these are hot linked in our database. So for example, Percival Gallagher, who did some of the drawings for planting fields, you would see that the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the Lilly Estate, which we'll hear about later today, was really Percival Gallagher's vision. And so, again, what we're trying to do is understand this mosaic, this tapestry of an American landscape that's been created by so many, and lift the veil on what Olmsted means. Okay, 9, as I said, extending the legacy, understanding who the players were. This is a drawing done by the Olmsted office for Fisk University. The Olmsteds were communicating on a fairly regular basis with David Williston, who was one of the first African-American practitioners in the country. When you compare Williston's drawings to the Olmsted firm's drawings, there's a lot of similarities here. The firm is clearly in conversation. We don't have a book on Williston to date. There have been a number of scholarly articles, and there are people who are looking into this career, but this too is ripe for reappraisal. The universities that are in the southern campuses, what is clear is during the 20s through even the 60s that the Olmsted firm had a lot of bread and butter work in southern university campuses. Those that are recognized on the National Register, like Ole Miss, focus only on the building architecture and not on the contributions of the firm. For those that are in search of a thesis topic and want to spend some time in the South, there are a great number of campus landscapes waiting to be rediscovered, and simple ground truthing that was done by Arlene Levy and Dina Tass-Winter, my co-authors on Experiencing Olmsted, who are both here with us today. We were delighted when we discovered how many of these campus landscapes still survive. I think cemeteries as well, largely below the radar, and in particular the ones that are out here on Long Island that I know we'll hear from Arlene Levy, and I don't want to steal any of that thunder, but these are extraordinary stories about new interpretations of memorialization, both collectively and individually, in a cemetery landscape. There are parks in other communities, again, they're below the radar, and they survive in great measure, like Herbie Park in Wilkes-Barre. There are private clubs like Charleston's Yeamans Hall. The Uplands in Victoria, BC, one of only two larger scale Olmsted residential enclaves, the other being in Calgary at Sunalta Addition. What's fascinating to me about this project is you see the kind of Beaux-Arts entrance ensemble. The images on the right-hand side, the Olmsteds write about the native people and cultural lifeways that were here before the Olmsted design, and it is respected in the Olmsted design, and this place now has been designated as having heritage value for all of these reasons in Victoria, BC. 10, expand the lens. These delicious drawings are all from the Fairstead collection, and we can see that there were women in this office. Who were they? This is one of my favorite images. There was an age differential between the young draftspeople and some of the clerical staff that were there. This is intriguing. It says lunchroom is misspelled on the slide, taken from men's lunchroom. Where did the women eat lunch? Were they fed? Like, how did that go down? Here's a Christmas card from 3233. You'll notice Edward Clark Whiting is the only male signature that is jumping off of that page. Who were these people? Were these people that contributed to the firm that allowed it to prosper? Helen Bullard shown in this image, which Arlene has taught me I can identify in sketches by her bun and her bustle. And so that clearly in silhouette is Miss Bullard. She was the highest paid female employee in the practice. These are stories waiting to be explored. We saw this image yesterday. This is at Palos Verdes, but when I saw this, I've always wondered, who's the skirt? Who is this? Who's that girl, as Madonna would say, sorry. Well, that was Stella Ops. That one was for you, Nord. Stella Ops, Wellesley College graduate. She worked alongside Junior for more than 4 decades. Why don't we know about her? So, and then when you go through images in the individual job files, you come across images like this, and you think, who is this? The person on the left, was he a stable hand? Was he a guide? What was his role in the Biltmore project? And then a group of Natalilies. If anyone here knows what this term means, I've now shown this image a few times publicly. I don't know what it means. This is a property in Columbus, Georgia. It's in the book. It's where the Columbus Museum is. The lower garden all survives today. It's a wonderful woodland walk with ericaceous plants. We have William Bell Marquis in the foreground center, and then what appears to be those that built that landscape. So there are greater stories to be told here, both within the Olmsted practice on the support team who are not landscape architects, and those that the firm was engaging with. Having great familiarity with the Baltimore parks, I was working on a project a couple of years ago, and I was intrigued by this statement. This is in the Olmsted Brothers 1904 plan. The public parks, being the property of the people, shall be open to all persons upon absolutely equal terms. So when you read that, what does that mean to you? Does it mean separate but equal? Does it mean that there was one swimming pool for black children and one swimming pool for white children, and if you measured those off spatially, they're about the same? The only difference is one is at a slightly higher elevation than the other. So what's going on here? And when we read reports from that period, is it the Olmsted's words? Is it the boilerplate that's they're being told? I don't know the answers to these questions, but certainly these are avenues that require reappraisal. The last image I'll show you from Baltimore in the files, and this is later, this is 1939. But in the same way that you saw the tidal basin with the colored pencils, which lead me to believe this is something that was generated in the Olmsted firm as a working analysis, we see here white and colored slums and blighted areas all distinguished from each other. You know, this requires an in-depth investigation to see, how did that park system grow? Where did the parks and parkways take shape? Was this a form of redlining through the articulation of the parklands? So there's a lot to unpack here. So when we say, I've done Olmsted, I say, no, you haven't. We've only just begun. This is also an interesting image to me. Apparently, Junior had a new Leica camera, and he was out trying it out in the Everglades. And this was one of the photographs that he shot that day. And I haven't read the Everglades report. You know, the firm had, I don't know the depth of the engagement, but there's not a lot of plans. But nevertheless, Olmsted took a photo of this family in the Everglades. We also know that the Olmsteds labeled things like on the LSU campus, they were very aware of Native American mounds, and they respected those in the design. We can see in the Atlanta parks, like Grant Park, that there were earlier earthworks there that were part of the military in the Civil War that were respected in the design. So we know that these things were being looked at and considered and often protected, but it hasn't really been studied. Olmsted, the innovator. Did the Olmsted firm introduce title blocks to the discipline of landscape architecture? Patricia's nodding yes. I love all of the drawn, traced, check by. I mean, this is really like a medical report for a project. It's incredible what you can see in one glance. Did Olmsted's invent the need to stage photography to sell the work? You know, for those people here from larger firms that have marketing and communications directors. I mean, when Dr. Cynthia Zizewski told me years ago that the cover of her book was staged, that you couldn't navigate the muddy river in that way, and then you look at the Chicago parks and think, well, J.W. Taylor was a well-known Chicagoland photographer at the time. These are staged images. And I was intrigued here, largely because at Coe Hall, that it was the patrons that engaged the women photographers like Frances Benjamin Johnson, and we can see the work upstairs. But it wasn't the Olmsted firm that was engaging the women photographers. I don't know about that one, Patricia, but it's curious to me. And we saw yesterday, I believe it was in Wittold's presentation, these sort of doodle overs, and they're here at Planting Fields as well. This is intriguing to me, sort of understanding what the existing vernacular was at Wyman Park in the Dell in Baltimore to sort of see and inform the new wall construction that had to be done and have it blend seamlessly. Before we had Photoshop, the Olmsteds were sort of figuring it out with these kinds of hand drawings and cut and paste exercises in Baltimore. Did the Olmsteds invent multiple alternatives? Are they the ones that started all of this that we all sort of do to this day? You see this on so many of the projects, this idea of sometimes, several, and then the ability to indulge in the creative process, to build models, to problem solve, to look at how a water is going to spray, to look at what the Corning fountain coping should look like on that fountain, the opportunity to engage at this level of detail. How many people here who are practicing landscape architects are afforded such time to investigate? And it's always great to see how they get to define city shaping, the location of buildings and communities again and again. The landscape architects are leading both in the design, the construction, and the stewardship. They're working with Collier to invent a tree moving machine for Prospect Park. Tree pruning. The image on the right, which was introduced to me by Arlene Levy, was done for Florida. This is Olmsted Jr. on his, quote, bug pole, where he could survey the land and get above the mosquito layer. If anyone's interested in seeing incredible reports on street trees that were written more than 100 years ago, look at the reports by the Olmsted firm for Baltimore and Washington, D.C. It balances science and aesthetics. It could have been written last week. These reports are extraordinary. We were not the first to have a deer problem. The Olmsteds were dealing with deer at the Iowani in 1927. These images really blew my mind. These were taken by George Gibbs. This is along the Genesee Valley Park when they're redesigning the watercourse. And they make every effort to say, everything that is below the red line shall be saved and replanted. These are natives. These do well here. They will stabilize the slopes, and we will protect them, and if necessary, we will replant them. This is extraordinary to me. And then finally, in closing, we've heard about this a lot, but the reality is we are all here. We can have these conversations because of the Herculean effort it has taken to not only safeguard this legacy, but to make it available, and now we can say so easily, to so many. It is extraordinary when I look back and think about the sort of rescuing of Fairstead. When I began at the Park Service in '92, I was there for 15 years. Dr. Connolly, who was the first person to run technical preservation services, had already retired, but he would make these sort of drop-in visits to go and see old friends. I was not one of those people, but I had the good fortune to meet him. And it was only after he had passed away that I realized that Dr. Connolly was one of the influential voices that led to the rescue and saving of Fairstead, noting about the place, his pencil notes. Good opportunity for new kind of National Historic Site, like a study center. Not the usual museum, no interpretation in usual sense. Building and contents of highest importance. And, here we have today the most significant landscape architectural collection in the country, if not the world. And as was said earlier, 6,000 projects, 138,000 plans, 100,000 photographs, 70,000 pages of plant lists, and 173 items in the Library of Congress. The work that we've done this past year at the Cultural Landscape Foundation to honor the bicentennial of Olmsted's birth has all happened because of this collection. And it's not just the accessibility of that collection, but the way in which it's been made available in such a free and open way. So the legacy has really propelled us forward in terms of both the archival legacy and those landscapes that have been rescued by so many communities. I think we have a few minutes for questions, but I should say that. And as of October 12th, we have 201,000 scanned images. I go back and check every week. I got so excited when it broke 200 recently. I felt like I was at a carnival and I had won a prize. But that was my Fred talk. Thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Charles, thank you for the lovable and lovably brilliant talk. I have a rather oblique Olmsted question. You mentioned in the 80s Renaissance the presence and the importance of then director of the National Gallery of Art, J. Carter Brown, who was also centrally involved in the development and adjudicating the controversies around the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and Maya Lin's difficulty in establishing that major monument and contribution to American monumental culture and landscape architectural culture. I'm interested to know if the Olmstedian perspective and Maya Lin's perspective and controversies ever came into dialogue with one another.
There are so many ways to answer that question. And so I'm going to sort of answer it through the lens of Olmsted and then through the lens of landscape architecture. When we think about so many of the monuments and memorials that we're hearing about at all of these Olmsted conferences that are taking place, Laurie Olin is going to likely talk about perhaps the Washington Monument at some point. He's not, so good, I'm on free terrain here. The thing that's incredible to me is when you see the drawings that Junior did as a commissioner on the Commission of Fine Arts. What he was able to achieve as a commissioner is extraordinary. When President Obama was in the White House, we had 3 commissioners of 7 who were landscape architects, the only time, to my knowledge, that has ever happened. And then we had a short period where there was not a single commissioner who was a landscape architect. So I want to be careful here first about conjoining that particular memorial, because that memorial really, when I think about that place, that is the story it is because of Grady Clay. Because Grady Clay was the jury chairman. There were several landscape architects who served on that commission. And the way Grady tells that story is Maya Lin's project was in the discard pile. He was the one that brought it back into the room, into the conversation. So the way that I'd like to answer that question is not so much about Olmsted specifically, but you cannot talk about the built environment without having landscape architects at the table. When there was the conundrum, when there was no commissioner, before Lisa Dole Place was appointed very recently, we asked Beth Meyer, who had served on the commission for 6 years, we just asked her roughly how many projects that come before the commission have a landscape component. And she told us 90%. Okay? So the reality is that this talk was about advocacy. And when we see a situation at any municipal level where a landscape architect that doesn't have a seat at the table, then we have to open our mouths and we have to make good trouble, because we cannot manage change without having a landscape architect and ideally a landscape historian, because they may not be the same person at the table. So I think in Grady Clay's case and in the other commissioners that served on that, it allowed for a bigness in both the interpretation in a way that we hadn't really seen before. And we're all now the beneficiaries of that brilliance on everyone's part. So thank you for that question.
Just as we can't really credit Olmsted himself for creating landscape architecture, can we blame the Olmsteds writ large for landscape historians? Was there really this breed of scholar, landscape historian, before this sort of 80s period when we thought, wow, this is a thing?
Well, I think the question for me is one of how did the firm value history? When the trustees of reservations are created in 1890 and Charles Eliot writes letters and it's only looking for men, he says, I'm looking for a few good men to deal with history, scenery, nature, and what he called history or oldie times. Okay, so that's the senior era. When we think about Olmsted Jr. getting paid a measly $12,000 to do the California State Park System in the late 1920s, we see that history is a cornerstone. We see Emerson's night work for interpreting places. So what we see in the work is a valuation of history. As Phyllis Anderson, for example, has written about Charles Sargent in Olmsted, when Sargent comes in at Mount Vernon to analyze what were the actual authentic trees planted by Washington, it would rival the work of a cultural landscape report today for vegetation management and renewal. So did they have someone who was trained as a historian? Probably not. But the question, and this is the question I'm asking in these last images, as we look at these breadcrumbs and traces of project work, how did they value history? And I think that, at least at a planning scale, we can definitely see that. And we can look at projects like the Emerald Necklace. I mean, Pine Bank was there, it stayed. Sometimes it might have been practical. But I like to think that their comfort zone was big enough that they brought multiple values to the table, both as planners and designers. I think perhaps it's time for coffee? No? Oh, I'm sorry. Only for me. Thank you all.